Sarah, I watched with interest a video that you did a little while ago called Why They Want Us to Go Cashless. And I was at a store recently, and they said, well, because of COVID, we don't want to touch cash, so please put your card in the reader. You don't find that reassuring, but is it because you don't think that epidemiologically it's good science, or do you think there's something else going on in the move to a cashless society?
I find it horrifying, actually. And it's not really anything virus related. I mean, we've passed around cash throughout every flu season, throughout every epidemic we've had. But what's happening now is something that's been planned for an extended period at this point. And what alarms me is the alternative. If you get rid of cash in society as you go to the grocery store and purchase your groceries and so on, then you have to rely on something else, naturally. And so what do we have? We have credit cards, or maybe a few of these newer things that you get on your smartphone if you have one, a program there. But in both those cases, you're giving up your independence, your privacy, and in many ways your choices to these companies that don't have our best interests in mind. Every major company like this has been engaged in political censorship already. This isn't something that I'm talking about in the future as a maybe down the road this might happen, but rather this is already happening. Whether you talk about the David Horowitz Freedom Center, who is a Christian who has spent a great amount of his time trying to expose Islam and, Muslim extremism and so on, or when you're talking about someone like Andrew Torba, who is the CEO of Gab.com. It's a social network, similar to Twitter or Facebook or so on, except for it allows for free speech up to the limits of United States law. He has been silenced by Visa. These are not even just banks. These are major credit card processing companies. That means there is no replacement. No matter where, if you have a bank, if you have a credit union, if you look at that little card that you're being asked to use in the grocery stores now, in many ways by force, you're going to see either Visa or MasterCard on that bank card. Whether it's a credit card or debit card, that's what you're going to see. That means that if both of those companies are engaged in political censorship and we are no longer accepting cash, we're accepting a future where people can be not just depersoned, but starved. Where people won't be able to do something as simple as buy those groceries or pay their power bill or pay their water bill, keep, these basic things that, I think it is a really dark time spreading. You won't be able to keep a roof over your head if you have the wrong opinion. I'm sorry.
Sarah, here are some things that I've observed. There always seems to be an ostensible good reason. So this poor soul, behind the counter at a store, who's not wearing gloves, who handled all the merchandise that I just handled, that everyone else in the world could have handled, that was fine, but wouldn't touch my cash because that might have some kind of cooties on it. And then we've been told they're cutting back on the printing of $100 bills, which are convenient if you want to carry a lot of cash, because that's part of the war on drugs, that drug gangs won't be able to have big cash transactions. It'll become impractical if you have to carry truckloads of single dollar bills rather than suitcases full of $100 bills. Well, all of that may or may not be plausible, but what concerns me, and I agree with you, every electronic transaction is tracked. I mean, I've been using credit cards since, I was in my early 20s. Somewhere out there is a record of absolutely every purchase I've ever made. I don't find that reassuring. I mean, I've never bought anything illegal or shameful or anything like that. I'm reminded of when Robert Bork was up before the Judiciary Committee being considered for the Supreme Court, and somebody hacked into the movies he was renting at Blockbuster. And he was vilified for that. I'm aware that firearms manufacturers are running into this too. On your view, we're really talking about progressive, in both senses of the word, progressive control of the economy and progressive control of resources. Where do you see this trending if it's not stopped?
Well, if it's not stopped, it is where I was alluding to before, a situation where people, not just in the political sphere, but also in the religious sphere, who will find themselves unable to feed and clothe their families. And I say in the religious sphere too, and I think that's important because increasingly there's overlap between the political world and I'm just going to say the Christian world. Because you have essentially a split amongst churches. And I'm just going to say this how I see it. I know some people will be offended. But the Christian churches who follow the Bible on things that are considered, controversial now, such as homosexuality, and those who don't, and who are leftist, progressive, and, as I see it, anti-Bible. And those who are more leftist in this are going to be left alone, but it's those who have those controversial views that, follow the Bible that are more likely to be cast out as, saying hate speech, for example. And this is something we already see going on over in England, not yet with the banking industry, but certainly with the government dictating that these churches can't read these certain passages from the Bible because those passages are offensive. Now, if you pair that with what's going on in our banking systems, our monetary systems, to cut off people who are offensive or who say, as they call it, hate speech, then what you're talking about is preventing churches from, collecting donations, from preaching in a very real sense, from being able to, pay their bills. You're shutting down ministers, preachers, priests, all of it. And so I think people fail to grasp, it would seem to me at least, that they fail to grasp how important the monetary system is to all of us. But there are people who do grasp it, and those people are those who are trying to push us towards a cashless society because it allows them an amount of control that is unfathomable.
Well, and emphasize on the verb grasp. I think that's very important as well. I mean, I remember a few years back, I think it was before the Supreme Court decision regarding same-sex marriage, the mayor of Houston, let's just say that she had a dog in that fight, demanded to read in advance the sermons of certain ministers to ensure that they didn't commit thought crimes or didn't meet her unwelcome speech, et cetera, et cetera. And I find that really quite alarming. I know in Canada they have these Star Chamber committees that are human rights, hate speech organizations, and ministers are saying, well, there's certain passages, say from Leviticus, that you're not allowed to read out loud. I mean, it might start with the putting a lid on your ability to get transactions for basic subsistence, but eventually they're going to put their thumb on your ability to express the powers of your soul and the calling of your heart. Is that too strong of a statement? Am I being an alarmist here?
No, I don't think you are at all. And I also don't think people see how far this goes. And I say that because I think that if everybody did see how far this goes, I think there would be people screaming. I think this would be the number one topic talked about today, because I don't think you can overstate how big of a deal it is. If I can for a moment go back to the Andrew Torba case, as a reminder, he's the CEO of Gab.com, the social network. Well, he was blacklisted by Visa, as I said, for simply running that free speech network. But more importantly than that is that his family members were blacklisted too. His wife was blacklisted, all his immediate family. Now, those people weren't running Gab, they simply knew him. They simply, in the case of his wife, lived at the same address. And so they all have this strike. Now, if she wants to start a lemonade stand and accept Visa, she can't. It doesn't matter how small of a business, nothing. When you really think about it, now you're talking about not just individuals, being silenced for their individual political views, but also their family members, perhaps their friends, their associates, and then you start to see just how dark this thing goes.
Right. I'm very much concerned, and if the political winds continue to blow in the direction that they're blowing, people are already drawing up enemies lists. They're making sure that Twitter accounts are not deleted because their scores are going to be settled in the coming new year if these people are to be taken at their words. So in this segment, I want to talk about protecting children. You have a very interesting and challenging video called "Why Don't We Protect Children Like We Do in Hungary?" And it's in that context that I want to bring to your attention that December 6th, according to the decree of the Governor Roy Cooper, was Gender Expansive Parents' Day. And in that proclamation, they talk about non-binary, gender expansive, and agender are used to describe a spectrum of gender identities that are not exclusively masculine and feminine, and that parenting for those who do not identify as mothers or fathers can be isolating. My heart's not warmed when I hear this. I'm not interested in throwing stones at anyone, but the idea that you want to parent without being a mother or a father, whose needs are being considered first in this context, on your view?
The mentally ill.
Well,
It's an
okay.
exercise. It's an exercise in delusion, but also in narcissism. I mean, if a man wants to say that he's a woman ordinarily, and it doesn't affect anybody else, it doesn't really affect me, and I might just look the other way. But the moment children enter the equation, it's entirely different. And let's just say, a woman who ought to be a mother is saying that she isn't going to be a mother to the child, then it's kind of an exercise in narcissism, because she's basically recentering the entire focus around herself. And yet we're celebrating that. Like, if anybody else did it, if I did it and said, actually, no, this parenting relationship that I have with my child, and we were both, normal and straight and everything, people would think that I was being selfish, that I was being narcissistic by recentering this dynamic around myself instead of my child. But yet, in these scenarios, things are entirely different. Because these people have become those that the collective left look up to so much, they're protected. And it seems like a child abuse celebration ceremony, basically, because honestly, that's what it is. And I've seen that so much in just the last week. It seems suddenly everywhere, as the media basically pushes it upon us. I saw an article in the Daily Mail celebrating something in California where 3 men, or as they called them, 3 dads, were raising 2 children. And there was no discussion of whether that was good for the children. There was no discussion of what it was like for the children to be raised, even just without a mother, ignoring the dynamic of, the 3 homosexuals and that, but just the absence of the mother even. There was nothing, because the children's needs don't matter in this conversation. And that's what's especially disturbing.
Right. See, that's what concerns me too, that somehow the child is seen as kind of a lifestyle accessory. Mm-hmm. And we're not centered. My friends who've brought children into the world or adopted children, said when you have a child, the center is torn out of yourself, and the center of your universe is working for the best benefit of the child. And when people say love is love, I want to say and tautologies are tautologies. Real love is wanting the best for the beloved. And what's best for the beloved is the way that God made us. And our bodies indicate that as male and female, as gender binary. Bodies work in a certain way, and we have certain psychological and spiritual needs that are met with mothers and fathers together. When I tell people I'm from a mixed marriage, my mother was a woman and my father was a man, people laugh somewhat nervously. And I said, 10 years ago, that joke would have been unintelligible. In 5 years, it may be hate speech. Let's shift the attention to Hungary. You did a very interesting video last week about some movements in Hungary to protect children. Talk to us about that, please.
Sure. In Hungary, they are making an effort to protect their children and to put their children first and foremost. They're almost certainly going to pass a constitutional amendment over there that would prevent homosexual couples from adopting children, and that would recognize the child's sex based upon his biological actual sex, thus prohibiting things like, as they call it now, gender transition, but as, we're talking really about hormone therapies to try and, prevent puberty, and of course genital mutilation to try and switch the gender. It's really barbaric. The more that you look into that, it's more barbaric than you can even imagine. But Hungary is going to change their laws to prevent the kind of barbarism that's going on even in the United States. And one thing that bothers me is the fact that it's difficult to even talk about this topic here in the United States already. That so many people cringe and cower at just the conversation. And to me, I accept that it's an uncomfortable conversation. However, I have no problem having uncomfortable conversations if it saves our kids. And I'm aghast at how many adults will cower and sacrifice our children at the altar of political correctness when they should be speaking up for those who can't speak up for themselves. And frankly, that's the thing, isn't it? You've got these leftists who talk about speaking for those who can't speak, and that when it comes to kids, they sacrifice them to their perverse ideology.
Well, yes, the people who claim to be advocates for the weak and the voiceless become really silent about children, those in the womb and those who are recently born and have had the temerity to survive their own abortion. Friends, I'm in conversation with Sarah Corrier. You may know her as the Crusader Girl, a very interesting and worthwhile voice emerging in alternative media. We're going to link to her website and her YouTube channel. In this segment, we're talking about protecting children. Sarah, I'm looking right now at your YouTube channel where you have the video about Hungary. I haven't happened upon any comments denouncing you as a hater, but somewhere out there, there's someone listening to us who is convinced that, I as a priest, I'm by definition, I'm a hater because I get my big fat check from the Vatican every month. You're a hater as well because you're not on board with rousing choruses of all are welcome. And I'm aware, too, that in major metropolitan areas like Boston and Philadelphia, Catholic adoption agencies have been effectively driven out of business because they won't cooperate with what we're talking about here. How do you answer the charges that, you're a hater, you want to burn people at the stake, you want to throw rocks at people? I'm sure you've encountered that since you've gotten into media. How do you begin to respond to that?
Well, I don't apologize for defending children, and I won't. I never will. I do understand some of what they say. I think they're wrong, but I understand. Like, for example, I received one message, it was private, it was an email, by someone who said something to the effect of, yes, but lots of heterosexual parents are bad. Which is true, and I come from a very dysfunctional home. I remember being young and looking at other kids who had a mother and a father who were both married, who lived in the same home, and thinking, how strange that must be. It was almost movie-like. And I say that in part because it was actually pretty rare amongst my friends to have that dynamic, because over in England, in a country that has forsaken Christ, you have broken families as the norm.
Right.
That said, when we're talking about things such as adopting children, we shouldn't be comparing the adoptees to the worst parents on earth and saying, well, look, they're slightly better than that. I think we should be trying to put children in good homes. We should be trying to put them in homes where they have a loving mother and a father. We shouldn't be saying, well, there's some heterosexual, really abusive couple out there somewhere, and that in some way justifies, denying this child the right to a mother and a father. I don't see that at all.
Right. And, we have to understand what a human person is, made in the image and likeness of God, with a body designed by God. And, if we understand what takes place in the human heart and the human body, we can begin to understand God's purposes for human life, and that's what natural law is. And then from there, theology completes what we can read in natural law. And to say that, hey, God made us a certain way, and sometimes we want things that are not good for us, and they're terrible consequences for ourselves and for others. And we need to be able to say these things out loud and say, this really isn't motivated by hate or to hurt people's feelings, but the truth really does set us free. And the truth is we were made in such a way that children really do need a mother and a father. And if that's not something that you're capable of, well, then, maybe parenting it isn't for you. And I think we need to be able to say that. And like I said, without apology. Let's shift back to Hungary for a moment. Hungary's definitely not on the cool kids table at the European Union these days. Have you heard anything about any blowback or Hungary with this law under consideration?
Not specifically against it, but I know that Hungary and Poland are constantly having issues with the European Union as two countries that are willing to, if I may, acknowledge Christ. They're the Christian countries out there in a sea of secularism and in a sea of evil. And when you look at the European Union and the way that it's decaying, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say so.
Right.
And, when you look at countries like Hungary and Poland, they look actually like bastions of freedom. And it's always interesting to me how when you see these Christian nations, you do see those bastions of freedom and happiness and prosperity. I don't think it's a coincidence that the two exist together.
Well, no, not at all. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and dare to suggest that the European Union has never really been a friend to Christianity. When they were putting together the European Union Constitution in the preamble, and they talked about sources of European identity, there was a decision made not to mention Christianity at all, which is unintelligible to me. It would be like doing a history of France and not mentioning wine. And when Poland said, "Hey, can't we mention something about Christianity?" they were nearly booted out of the Union. So I think there's been a long-standing animus against Christianity in the European Union. I think we can't afford to be naive about that. And I think that animus is towards Christianity, really authentic biblical Christianity, a Christianity that also acknowledges natural law, is going to be on the to-do list of the church's political enemies. I think more and more faithful Christians are going to find themselves progressively unwelcome in their own country. We can't afford to be naive, and Christian communities can't afford to be dependent upon tax dollars to sustain their corporal works of mercy, because those dollars always come with strings attached. Sarah, you're obviously not from around these here parts. You came from Britain. You've been here for a while. You've been observing politics. We're having a bit of an electoral kerfuffle these days. I think that's a technical term. As an American who grew up believing what he learned in his junior high school civics class about the Constitution and America not being like other places, what do you make of recent history and what might be coming down the pike?
Well, it doesn't look great. I'll give you that. It seems like there's been a massive fraud that has taken place. Honestly, I don't see any other way to say it at this point. I remember sitting there on election night, watching with, some friends and talking to them about what was happening, and looking over in Pennsylvania and saying, well, the mail-in votes aren't in yet, but we're 600,000 ahead, and there's no way the Democrats can make it up. And then at 4 a.m, everything changed. At 4 a.m, when they'd stopped counting for the evening, and that was replicated in various other states after they had supposedly stopped counting, and then suddenly at 3:30 or 4, things just changed on a dime. And more honestly, it's concerning because it gives people few options for remedy. Because As I look around and talk to different people, the system of voting in our republic is how people air their grievances. And when they can't, you're sitting on a powder keg. And so that concerns me for the future of America. It really does. Because in the past, you've had situations where people often weren't happy with who got elected. That's, the story is old of time. But they believed that the system was fair. They just maybe didn't like their fellow Americans and who they voted for very much. But when they don't, when at least half of them doesn't, it's a very explosive situation.
Well, no, I agree with you. There's an old saying in America that says, ballot box, jury box, ammo box. And I really don't want us to move in that direction. But if you don't have a sane, sober, rational, obviously fair way of resolving differences and disputes and adjudicating grievances, then eventually other means, other more kinetic, other less rational means will come to the fore, because all that high pressure steam has to go somewhere. And when I look at the data, when I look at the evidence, I've read some of the court filings, you would be hard pressed to make the case that this was a safe, secure, and fair election. And I say that just looking at the evidence, not being a partisan for one candidate or another. Sarah, one of the things that suggested to me, I said, well, Father, it sure does look shady, but rather than get people upset, let's just be gracious losers and we'll do better next time. Do you find that exhortation reassuring?
Not in the least. I think that would be a prudent thing to do if you had simply lost fairly. No matter how unhappy you were with the person who won, that would be the gracious and correct thing to do. But if the election system itself is unfair, then no, I don't think that accepting it is the right thing to do at all. If the people's voice has been silenced, then that doesn't make sense. And one thing that I fear, and I feel like I kind of have to mention this, is that so many elected officials right now seem to be ruling against the evidence. And I mean this in the case of judges, in the case of state legislatures, and so on. And one thing that bothers me is I think the reason that so many are doing it is out of fear. Not out of, them disbelieving the evidence or something like that, but rather out of fear of leftist violence, because groups identifying by different names, whether it's Antifa or Black Lives Matter or what have you, have been burning cities and showing up at the homes of legislatures and mayors and so on for months now. And I think that we have reached a point where politicians and judges are actually afraid of these people. And as a result of that, it's going to change their rulings, their judgments, and so on. Thus, I do think that we need to have people in positions of power who aren't afraid, who believe in something greater. And that's where faith is important. And I think that we're seeing manifest the lack of faith. There's this kind of trope of, faith over fear. And I think there's a lot of truth in that when a person fears God above all else, then he's likely to look at Black Lives Matter, protesting on his front lawn as far less problematic than somebody who is completely secular. And I think as we've moved to a less Christian society, we have more people who are afraid of this world more than the next.
Could you tell us some more about that? Because very often people, they either separate faith from politics, or they make their politics the primary good and then assume God is going to bless it. Surely Jesus would not drive an SUV, or surely when our Lord drives a Prius, he would have a coexist bumper sticker on it. And C.S. Lewis, warned us against that decades ago in the Screwtape Letters. Tell us about that spirit of fear and that lack of faith and how it may be playing out in the political arena.
Well, I think that we have politicians who are pretty godless, but they're godless. A large portion of them are communist. Okay, that they are, even when they don't admit it. And when you have communism, and even its lighter forms, what you have is a religious adherence to government. And that's kind of what we're starting to see in America, but also what we've seen for some time spread around the world. Like, people don't get this until you ask them to look at a place like North Korea and look at their religious symbols, their deity. And of course that would be Kim Jong-un, right? That's their president, worshipped as a god. And when you look over in China, in the communist country over there, you see that very same worship of their leader. And that's what communism does. It replaces God with a man or with the Communist Party and gets everybody to worship them and see no higher authority. And that's what we're starting to see in America, I think, as America becomes more secular and you have more of these politicians who see nothing greater and who increasingly worship the state, who worship the government, who, are morally vacuous as a result.
Sarah, I want to dwell some more on that relationship between church and state, because I think that really needs to be handled thoughtfully and with clarity and not impulsively the way I see a lot of people do. But here's what concerns me. Part of that loss of faith leads to the collapse of Christian community, which leads to the collapse of Christian work. If you're a church hierarch, if you're a branch manager, so to speak, you still have a bureaucracy to pay for. How are you going to keep them in business? Well, you bring them to the taxpayer trough and keep the bureaucracy going that way under the guise of charity. Isn't there the danger of Christian communities becoming compromised to the degree that they accept tax dollars? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, in fact, I think one of the biggest problems with the churches today is actually the 501c3 status. That's the tax-free status that nowadays churches file under. It's what grants them, the ability to not pay taxes on their income. But it also means that they have to avoid talking about certain topics. They can't be political, they can't be partisan. But that translates into, in many ways, simply ignoring one's conscience or even refusing to preach the Bible in some cases. Like, for example, let's say there was a politician who wanted to push some war that was so very obviously wrong. Well, the preacher couldn't speak against that, not and get his 501c3 status.
Mm-hmm.
So then he has to choose between his money and saying what is biblical and what he believes to be right. And I think the vast majority of churches in this country are choosing the money. And I think it's why we have so many churches that are so awful now. I hate to say it, but who are so absolutely awful and who are so unwilling to speak up on things like what we just discussed in the last segment about protecting our children, about these trans story hours, about the mixed bathrooms being forced in children's schools. These things that you would expect the church to be speaking up as the moral authority, because I would say that's its job. It's instead laying down its arms because I see nothing greater than the tax write-off, which is gross.
Well, St. Ignatius Loyola, who's the founder of the Society of Jesus, warned Christians against what he called pride, riches, and honors. And I understand that, we don't live on air and grace alone, that, institutions need to pay bills, et cetera, et cetera. And I understand that. I also think that Christians have a profound moral obligation to provide for the material support of their own Christian communities, and I agree with that too. But during the emergence of the COVID interruption, which is a very complicated, multidimensional topic we can't deal with in depth in this segment, a very prominent archbishop said that the number one priority for him was the physical health of the members of his archdiocese, and I'm sad to say, sir, I was inclined to agree with him. That is his number one priority. I don't think it should be. I think Christians need to be more bold about answering to a higher power, and that the needs of the soul need to be addressed as well. And I think that part of the COVID interruption has shown that the state's animus to the church, that you can get a massage or an abortion or buy marijuana or buy alcohol, but you can't go to church because reasons. And I think that there are politicians who like having that kind of power over people, and especially over churches. Is that too dark a view, do you think?
No, not at all. And it's not even just that, if I might say. It's that there are so many who, well, you were talking about the physical health, right? This desire to protect physical health above all else. But what about freedom? I mean, okay, we discussed the moral issue, but what about just freedom? Is it enough to be alive but live on our knees? Is it enough to be alive but give up all of our rights? Because that's the situation that we're living in now. I mean, I'm here in North Carolina. We're under a curfew. We haven't committed any crimes in North Carolina, but there's a curfew somehow, as if we're in a prison. We're using these terms like lockdown, which were previously only used in a prison. That's what it meant. Mm-hmm. All the prisoners have to go back to their cells and stay. And it's all being done under the guise of, well, it's the physical health. We all have to survive, and it's just about saving that one life.
Well, and saving lives is a very fine thing. And for people who want to save lives, I really want to talk to them about the health and moral meaning of children in the womb. And unless that's a priority, I'm really not interested in what other people say about the need to save lives. I think we're being lied to. And Sarah, I think the important work that you're doing is helping people wake up to that fact. So, Carrier, God bless you. Your good work. Thank you for being a very fine guest. I hope we can have another on-air conversation soon.
Thank you, and I do too, especially on that topic of the virus, because as I said, so much has been given up under the guise of fighting it, and it's not a big deal for the vast majority of people, and that science is being manipulated to make people afraid to do such things as to go to church.
Right, I agree. We have to up our game and be better lie detectors and better truth detectors.